David Cole awoke to the familiar gray light of a Seattle dawn filtering through the bedroom curtains. The gentle patter of rain against the window pane was a comforting, constant presence in their lives, as ordinary as the first sip of morning coffee. He lay in bed for a moment, listening to the city's distant hum and the soft breathing of his wife Sarah beside him. In moments like this, he often thought about how lucky he was. From the outside, David and Sarah's life together was idyllic. They were a young, ambitious couple living in a renovated craftsman house in Seattle's Queen Anne neighborhood. David was a talented screenwriter whose indie drama had won a minor award the year before, launching him into some acclaim. Sarah ran a small but thriving practice as a psychological counselor, helping clients navigate their personal struggles. Their careers were taking off, and they supported each other's passions with genuine enthusiasm. On weekdays, their mornings followed a comforting routine. David would brew fresh coffee, dark roast, a Seattle staple, while Sarah showered and dressed for work. They often exchanged affectionate banter in the kitchen as they prepared for the day. That morning was no different. Sarah came down the stairs wrapped in a towel, her auburn hair still damp, and found David humming softly as he poured 2 mugs of coffee. "Smells great," she said, flashing him a warm smile as she tightened the belt of her robe. She tiptoed to plant a light kiss on his cheek. "You always know how to start my day, right?" David grinned. "Only the best for you." He handed her a mug. "Sleep well?" Sarah cradled the warm mug in her hands and took a sip before answering. Like a rock. I had the strangest dream, though, but it's already fading." "Maybe one of your clients gave you weird ideas yesterday," David teased gently. He leaned against the counter, watching as she moved around the kitchen to fix a quick breakfast of toast and fruit. "Maybe," she said, shrugging with a small smile. "Or maybe I'm just overdue for a vacation." Her tone was light, but David noted a hint of fatigue in her eyes. "Well, Dr. Reed," he used her professional name playfully, earning an eye roll from her. "If the esteemed psychologist is recommending a vacation, who am I to argue?" Sarah laughed softly, swatting his arm with a dish towel. "Not a doctor, just a counselor. Don't jinx me with more schooling." She took another sip of coffee and sighed contentedly. "But a weekend getaway might be nice when our schedules allow." They chatted about mundane things, the predicted rainstorm that evening, a new restaurant opening downtown, and David's upcoming meeting with a producer interested in his latest screenplay. It was a comfortable, loving morning ritual that set a positive tone for their day. Later, after Sarah had left for her office and the house was quiet except for the ticking of the living room clock, David settled into his home office to work on polishing that screenplay. He often worked from home, enjoying the freedom to set his own hours. His desk overlooked the rain-slick street outside, where neighbors' cars splashed through puddles. By mid-afternoon, he needed a break. Writing had gone slowly. His mind wandered more than usual. David realized he hadn't eaten since breakfast. He headed to the kitchen to fix a sandwich, passing by the small second bedroom they had converted into Sarah's study. The door was slightly ajar, and he instinctively peeked in as he walked past. Sarah's study was cozy, walls lined with psychology books, a few diplomas, and certifications framed neatly, and a plush armchair by the window where she often curled up to read. On her desk sat her personal laptop and a neat stack of folders. David smiled to himself, picturing her perched there late at night writing up case notes or journal entries. Sarah had a reflective streak. Sometimes she wrote in a diary or drafted fictional vignettes to unwind after a stressful day with clients. He recalled how a few months ago she had mentioned wanting to try writing a book someday, a psychological novel, perhaps combining her professional insights with storytelling. He'd encouraged her, of course, finding the idea endearing. But whenever he'd asked about her progress, she'd blush and dismiss it as just scribbles, nothing worth showing yet. David respected her privacy, never pressing further. On this day, however, something on the desk caught his eye. Amidst the orderly space was a small USB flash drive, translucent blue and unmistakably out of place atop a stack of papers. It wasn't there before, at least not in plain view. Perhaps Sarah had been backing up some files? David hesitated. He normally wouldn't pry into Sarah's personal work, but the flash drive drew his curiosity. If it contained a draft of her supposed novel, Maybe she had left it out intentionally, a subconscious invitation for him to take a look? Or perhaps she simply forgot to put it away in a hurry that morning. He gently picked up the USB drive, turning it between his fingers. Out of respect, he almost set it back down without looking. But then he thought of how secretive she'd seemed about her writing lately. Maybe she needed encouragement? As a fellow writer, he knew how isolating the creative process could be. Perhaps reading a bit of what she wrote could help him support her better. With a mix of guilt and curiosity twisting in his stomach, David walked to his own computer in the adjacent office. He plugged the flash drive into his laptop, heart beating a little faster at the small breach of trust. A single folder popped up on the screen, labeled Manuscript. He clicked it open. Inside were several document files. The largest one was titled The Parallel Life Draft. The timestamp showed it was updated just 2 nights ago. That night, he remembered falling asleep early while Sarah stayed up late in her study, saying she had paperwork to finish. Instead, it seemed she had been working on this. The Parallel Life, David murmured under his breath. The title intrigued him immediately. He double-clicked the file and a document opened, filled with dense text. Scrolling a bit, he saw it formatted in chapters like a novel. This was indeed her book draft. A pang of guilt hit him again. Was it right to read her unfinished novel without permission? He shook it off. If Sarah was keeping this a secret, why leave the drive out in the open? Maybe she did want him to find it, part of her too shy to ask him directly to read it. They shared everything else in life. Surely she wouldn't mind, would she? His sandwich forgotten, David began to read. It started innocently enough, an introduction about a couple who seemed to resemble them in some ways. The protagonist was a woman, a therapist named Sadie, and her husband was an artistic type named Daniel. David couldn't help but smile at the similarity of those names to Sarah and David. Perhaps this was Sarah's way of fictionalizing their life for the novel. Many first-time authors wrote semi-autobiographical stories. It was flattering in a way that she'd base it on them. As he read on, however, David's frown gradually replaced his smile. The story's couple had a seemingly perfect marriage on the surface, but Sadie harbored secrets. Early chapters alluded to Sadie feeling that something was missing in her life, a restlessness even as she loved her husband. David paused, realizing this was something Sarah had never expressed to him openly. They were always affectionate and communicative, weren't they? A worm of worry wriggled in his mind, but he brushed it aside. It was just fiction after all. He continued reading, drawn in by Sarah's graceful writing. She described Seattle's moody atmosphere with loving detail, the drizzle on the window of Sadie's office, the evening fairy horns in the distance as Sadie stayed late at work. It was good, really good. David found himself impressed by how vividly Sarah could write settings and emotions. Why had she been so shy to share this talent? About 20 pages in, the tone of the story changed. Sadie met a new character, a charismatic man named Alexander, who was introduced as a client at first, seeking therapy. David's brow furrowed slightly at the detail. Sarah usually kept strict ethical boundaries in her practice, and seeing her fictional counterpart crossing lines, even just befriending a client more personally, was surprising. In the novel, Sadie initially struggled with the professional boundary but found Alexander mesmerizing. He was wealthy, confident, and ran a successful chain of high-end nightclubs in the city. David's heart kicked up a notch. He knew this was fiction, yet something about Alexander felt vividly drawn, as if he were a real person Sarah had met. The clubs, the magnetic personality. Had Sarah come across someone like this through a client or at an event? As far as David knew, they rarely went to nightclubs, and their social circle was more artsy than the slick nightlife crowd. Still, writers often borrowed from reality. Perhaps Sarah had read about some club owner, or this was purely imaginative. He read on, unable to stop. The story quickly escalated into territory that made David increasingly uneasy. Sadie's chance meeting with Alexander blossomed into a secret friendship, which then turned into a passionate affair. The novel detailed late-night rendezvous in the hidden VIP lounges of Alexander's clubs, intimate whispers in the back of a limousine, and weekends where Sadie lied to her husband so she could escape with Alexander to a secluded ocean cabin. David's hands went cold on the keyboard. This was far beyond a mild fictional scenario, It was a full-blown double life. The title, The Parallel Life, now made sense. Sadie was living two lives, one with her loving husband Daniel, and another in the shadows with Alexander, filled with lust and danger. His stomach clenched as he read a scene in which Sadie returned home from a tryst, slipping into bed next to her sleeping husband, feeling both guilty and exhilarated. The writing was so vivid that David could almost smell the rain and salt on Sadie's skin as she described showering away the scent of Alexander's cologne. He sat back, rubbing his temples. The logical part of his mind insisted this was fiction, just a story Sarah concocted. But the emotions churning in his gut felt real, a mix of betrayal and hurt, as if he had caught a glimpse of something he wasn't meant to see. David glanced at the time. Over an hour had passed. He realized with a start that he had been utterly engrossed and that his coffee had gone cold. He needed fresh air, or at least a moment to collect himself. Slipping the flash drive from his computer, he left it on his desk for now and stood, pacing to the living room. Out the window, the afternoon sky hung low and dark, the rain picking up in intensity. Usually, the Seattle rain soothed him, but now he barely noticed it. He was replaying details from the manuscript in his mind. The way Sadie described Alexander's piercing green eyes, the expensive wine he poured her at an upscale restaurant that David had never heard Sarah mention. The book contained things, places, sensory details, even lines of dialogue that felt more like memories than invention. Could it be possible that Sarah was writing about herself? About them? No, it couldn't. Sarah would never violate her ethics by getting involved with a client, nor would she cheat. They were happy. They were solid. And yet, the novel's couple mirrored them so closely in setup. Perhaps a dark thought crept in. That was intentional. She might have wanted to write about a path she didn't take, or secret fantasies as some kind of catharsis. That was a less alarming interpretation. Writers did that too, exploring what-if scenarios through fiction. Maybe Sarah was entirely faithful in real life, but simply imagined how life might be if she weren't. David wanted to believe that. It was easier to accept this as pure imagination. Still, something nagged him. The authenticity of the scenes, specifics about Alexander's world, where would she get those? She wasn't exactly a fixture in the nightclub scene, and he didn't recall her interviewing anyone who was. He walked back to the study, drawn to the manuscript like a moth to flame. He had to read more, if only to quiet the gnawing doubt in his heart by proving to himself it was all made up. Returning to his chair, David opened the document again and continued with a mixture of dread and compulsion. As he read deeper into the afternoon, each page pulled him further into a haze of uncertainty. The novel's plot thickened with secrets and lies. Sadie juggled her two lives, growing more entangled with Alexander's dangerous world. There were hints that Alexander's club empire had ties to illegal activities, a passing reference to illicit deals in VIP rooms, an incident where Sadie overheard Alexander angrily threatening someone over the phone about a shipment. These elements introduced suspense and danger into the narrative beyond the affair itself. David's heart pounded as a chapter described Sadie traveling with Alexander to Los Angeles under the pretense of a professional conference when, in truth, it was a passionate weekend getaway. Sarah had gone to a psychology conference in LA just 6 months ago, David recalled, which she'd spoken of as uneventful. In the story, Sadie's feelings were conflicted, guilt-ridden yet addicted to the thrill. She even considered ending the affair after that trip, shaken by how deeply she'd fallen for Alexander, but ultimately she couldn't break away. David pushed back from the desk, taking a deep breath. He realized his hands were trembling. Piece by piece, the coincidences were stacking up uncomfortably. Dates, places, professions, even that conference, it all corresponded to real aspects of their lives, just twisted into a darker version. If this novel was purely hypothetical, it was an uncanny reflection of reality. But if it wasn't hypothetical, the alternative was too painful to fully accept just yet. He stood and stared out the window at the rain-blurred street. His half-eaten sandwich and the whole afternoon had been forgotten. In his chest, an ache formed that he tried to deny was the first sting of betrayal. This was crazy, he thought. He needed to talk to Sarah. No, he needed to be sure first. He didn't want to accuse her of anything based on a piece of fiction if that's all it was. Perhaps the stress of their busy lives had made him paranoid, Sarah was a creative person too. Maybe she simply poured her fantasies or composite client stories into this project. He should finish reading it and gather his thoughts calmly. David returned to the manuscript, steel in his spine now as he read every line with sharp attention, almost like a detective searching for clues. He began to jot down notes on a pad. Any detail from the novel that had a real-world counterpart he recognized. Sadie and Daniel's anniversary dinner at the Mirrored Lake Inn, where Sadie slipped out to call Alexander. He and Sarah had spent their last anniversary at a lakeside inn outside the city, and he did recall her stepping away to take a call from a client that night. A scene where Sadie hides a text chain under a fake name in her phone. He vaguely remembered once seeing an unknown number flash on Sarah's phone late at night, which she dismissed as a wrong number. Mention of an emerald bracelet Alexander gifted Sadie, which she hid in her office drawer at home. Sarah had a jewelry box that he rarely looked through, but did she have any emerald jewelry he hadn't given her? He wasn't sure. By the time the sky had darkened and a true storm was rolling in, David had read through most of the manuscript. Each chapter left him more convinced that what he was reading was not just a product of Sarah's imagination, but a veiled confession or account of real events. The realization felt like stepping into open air and finding no solid ground. He was falling, stomach lurching with disbelief and fear. How long had this been going on? Who exactly was this Alexander in real life? And why? Why would Sarah do this? Then write it down as if daring fate. David's jaw clenched. He closed the document and removed the flash drive, quickly returning it to Sarah's study desk exactly as he found it. His mind was racing, heartbroken and angry and confused all at once. Yet he knew he had to keep his composure, at least until he had more than circumstantial evidence from a piece of writing. Tonight, when Sarah came home, he would have to act as if nothing was wrong. The thought of feigning ignorance made him feel sick, but confronting her now could backfire if he was wrong somehow. Or worse, if he was right, he couldn't predict how she'd react. Would she deny everything? Turn it around on him for invading her privacy? Or would she break down and admit the truth? He wasn't ready for that confrontation, not yet. He needed proof, facts. Only then could he face her with certainty. As he heard the familiar sound of Sarah's car pulling into the driveway, David took a deep breath and steadied himself. He forced his features into a relaxed expression and moved away from the study, going back to the kitchen to reheat some leftovers for dinner, as if nothing unusual had happened. Sarah entered the kitchen a few minutes later, shaking the rain from her umbrella and smiling when she saw David at the stove. "Hey you, smells good in here," she said warmly, hanging up her damp coat. She came over to give him a quick kiss on the cheek. Her affection was the same as ever, but David stiffened just for a heartbeat before forcing himself to relax. "Hey," he replied, hoping his voice sounded normal. He busied himself with stirring the reheated pasta so he wouldn't have to meet her eyes for too long. "Hope you don't mind leftovers. I was in the zone writing and lost track of time." "Leftovers are fine," Sarah said easily as she took out plates. "I'm starving. Today was a lot." "Tough session?" he asked, referring to her day with clients. Normally, he would step closer and rub her shoulder in support when she looked this exhausted, but tonight he held back, unsure of his own emotions. Sarah sighed and gave a little shrug. "Couple of my clients had emotional breakthroughs that were heavy. And one new client with a pretty intense situation. I'm just drained." She offered a faint smile and then changed the subject lightly. "How about you? How was the writing? Get much done?" David swallowed. Her question was innocent, routine, yet he felt a flash of anger at how easily she could ask it, as if nothing at all was wrong. He struggled to keep his cool. "Made some progress," he lied evenly. "Polished a few scenes. Still a long way to go, though." "You'll get there," she encouraged, rubbing his arm affectionately before moving to pour them both some water. "I can't wait to read it someday." The casual kindness in her voice stung. David managed a tight smile and nodded. Dinner was ready, and they settled at the small dining table by the window. The conversation stayed ordinary. Comments about the food, the news that the rain might turn to a thunderstorm overnight, an anecdote about a funny thing one of Sarah's colleagues said that afternoon. David responded where appropriate, even chuckled at the right moments, but inside he felt like an actor reciting lines on cue. As Sarah talked, he found himself studying her intently. She looked a little tired, yes, but otherwise so normal. The woman across from him was the same loving wife who that morning kissed him and joked about vacations. Now those memories felt distant and fragile. How could she sit here, calm and untroubled, while having written what she did? Could she really compartmentalize her life so well? Or was he imagining layers of deceit that didn't exist? A sudden clap of thunder echoed faintly outside, and Sarah glanced toward the window. Wow, it's really coming down, she murmured. She didn't seem nervous. Why would she be? To her, it was just another rainy night with her husband. David realized he hadn't heard most of what she said just then. Sorry, what was that? He asked, trying to play off his distraction. She gave him a curious look. I was just saying we might want to light the fireplace if the power goes out. Are you feeling okay? You seem quiet tonight. I'm fine, he said, perhaps a bit too quickly. He softened it with a small smile. Just tired. I really got lost in the work today. All right, Sarah said gently. She reached across the table to squeeze his hand. Her fingers were warm and familiar, and for a second David almost forgot the turmoil within him. Maybe an early night after this, then. Yeah, he agreed quietly. They finished dinner and cleaned up together, chatting in their usual comfortable rhythm. Or at least Sarah chatted and David pretended to listen, his mind elsewhere. Soon after, Sarah headed upstairs, saying she wanted to read in bed for a while before sleep. David nodded and told her he'd join her soon, needing to wrap up a few notes on his script first. In reality, as soon as she was out of sight, his face fell into a grim mask of determination. He had gotten through the evening without arousing her suspicion. Now he had to take the next step, finding out if the world he'd glimpsed in her manuscript was truly, indisputably real. Outside, the rain continued to fall in cold sheets, drumming on the roof. Inside, David felt the first chill of a storm gathering in his life, one that would upend everything he thought he knew. The perfect life he believed he had was beginning to show cracks, and through them, he glimpsed a truth more disturbing than he could have imagined. Chapter 2. Distorted Mirror. Much later that night, long after Sarah had fallen asleep, David lay awake in the darkness. His mind refused to rest, replaying scenes from the manuscript and the quiet moments at dinner when he had to pretend nothing was wrong. Beside him, Sarah's breathing was deep and steady. He envied how she could sleep so peacefully. David carefully slipped out of bed, determined not to waste the cover of night. He had evidence to gather. Moving silently through the house, David first went to Sarah's home office. A small nightlight in the hallway provided just enough illumination to navigate without turning on lamps. He opened the door to the study and quietly closed it behind him. The room was neat as ever. Sarah had always been organized. He pulled a pen light from a drawer, a leftover prop from a film project that now served as a useful tool, and clicked it on, casting a thin beam of light. His first target was the wooden jewelry box atop the bookshelf. In the novel, Sadie hid an emerald bracelet from Alexander in an office drawer, but here at home, Sarah kept most of her jewelry in this box. David's hands felt oddly numb as he lifted the lid. Inside, neatly arranged, were earrings, necklaces, and bracelets, many of which he recognized as gifts he'd given her over the years or pieces she'd bought on trips. He rifled carefully through the compartments, heart pounding at the thought of what he might find. Then he saw it. A delicate bracelet with a single emerald charm tucked into a corner beneath a tangle of costume jewelry. David's breath caught in his throat. He didn't recall ever seeing this piece before, and he certainly had never given it to her. Gently, he picked it up between his fingers and examined it under the penlight. The emerald was real, small but deep green, set in a simple white gold chain. It was understated, the kind of thing one might not notice unless looking for it. Exactly the kind of gift Alexander would give Sadie in the book. David turned the bracelet over, looking for an inscription or clue. There, on the underside of the clasp, were two engraved letters, A.M. His stomach clenched. A for Alexander, surely, and perhaps M for a last name. In the novel, the man's name was just Alexander, but of course he would have a full name in reality. The bracelet was practically a signature. He carefully set it back exactly where he found it, mind racing. That was concrete evidence, at least to him, that something was truly amiss. If he confronted Sarah with it, what would she say? She might claim it was a gift from a grateful client or a friend, but combined with everything else he knew, the lie would be thin. Still, David wasn't ready to confront her. Not until he had the whole picture and a plan. Next, David eased open the drawers of the desk. If Sarah had been documenting a secret life, perhaps there were other hidden tokens or information. The first drawer held only stationery, sticky notes, and pens. In the second, tucked beneath some folders, he found a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully. It was a hotel reservation printout from months ago for a weekend at a resort in wine country. A reservation under Daniel and Sadie Miller. David recognized the alias immediately. Those were the names of the couple in her novel. It was as if Sarah had used their fictional names to cover a real getaway. The dates on the reservation overlapped with a weekend she had indeed been away at a professional retreat. His jaw tightened at the confirmation staring back at him. He replaced the paper and closed the drawer softly, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. The evidence was piling up. Sarah's parallel life was real, and she'd left breadcrumbs of it everywhere, perhaps never thinking he'd have reason to look for them. Back in his own office, David sat down at his computer. He felt eerily calm now, a cold determination taking over the initial shock. If Alexander was real, David needed to know exactly who he was dealing with. He opened a web browser and began searching terms he recalled from the manuscript. Seattle nightclub owner Alexander, club chain CEO Seattle, and variations of the name combined with the city. It didn't take long to find a promising lead. An article in a local business journal mentioned a Alexander Markham, owner of Markham Entertainment Group, which operated several high-end nightclubs in Seattle and Portland. The article was about an upcoming charity gala at one of his venues and featured a photo. David's breath caught as he clicked the thumbnail to enlarge it. The man in the photo was in his early 40s, handsome in a polished way. Dark hair slicked back, a strong jaw, and even in the still image David could imagine the charisma in his smile. The kicker was his eyes, a striking green. The caption identified him as Alexander Markham, Alexander M. A.M., the initials on the bracelet. It had to be him. David's pulse pounded in his ears. Markham was a respected name in the nightlife scene. David vaguely recalled hearing about a trendy club called Solstice that had opened last year, drawing celebrities and tech elite. Apparently, Markham owned that and more. Reading on, he learned that Alexander Markham had moved to Seattle from Los Angeles several years back and quickly built his empire. The article lauded his business acumen and philanthropic efforts. David almost scoffed at the irony, a philanthropist homewrecker. Now that he had a full name and face, David dug deeper. He found Markham's social media profiles, business records, anything he could late into the night. The more he read, the more the novel's details matched. Markham was unmarried but often photographed with beautiful women in nightlife spreads. He owned at least 3 clubs in Seattle, including one in Belltown that catered to an exclusive clientele. In Sarah's novel, Sadie's lover had taken her to a private club lounge after hours, likely based on one of these real locations. It was past 3 a.m. when David finally closed the browser. Exhaustion tugged at him, but his mind wouldn't fully shut down. He knew who Alexander was now. The last thing he did was jot down Markham's office address and the addresses of his clubs. There would be no sleeping for David that night, only a restless lying in wait for dawn, as his resolve began to harden into a plan. The next morning, David felt the weight of his sleepless night like a stone, but he forced himself through the motions of normalcy. Over breakfast, Sarah chatted about an upcoming professional development workshop she planned to attend on Friday evening, reminding him that she'd be home late. David nodded along, masking his knowledge that this workshop was likely another rendezvous in her parallel life. She frowned slightly at the circles under his eyes and asked if he was feeling okay. He mumbled something about a writing deadline stress, assuring her he'd be fine. All through Thursday, David's nerves simmered beneath a veneer of calm. He caught a few hours of fitful sleep once Sarah left for work, then spent the afternoon methodically preparing for what he would do next. He wasn't content to just confirm the affair. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. Only then would the reality fully sink in, and only then could he decide how to act on it. Friday arrived with a gray, drizzly dusk that gave way to a rare, dry evening. Sarah came home after work to change clothes before her supposed workshop. David pretended to be engrossed in his script notes in the living room, scarcely glancing up as she breezed in and out of the bedroom, changing into a casual chic outfit of dark jeans and a blouse. He wondered if she chose that black blouse because Alexander liked it. The thought made his stomach twist. "Don't wait up, okay?" Sarah said, popping her head into the living room as she grabbed her purse and keys. She gave him a sweet, apologetic smile. "I know it's Friday, but this seminar might run late. There's a networking thing afterward." David forced a relaxed smile to his face. "No worries. I might work late myself. Good luck. Have fun." "Thanks. Love you," she said casually. "Love you too," he replied, the words bitter on his tongue even as he said them. He kept his eyes on his notebook, afraid that if he looked up, she'd see the rage and hurt in them. The moment he heard the door close and Sarah's car back out of the driveway, David jumped into action. He quickly donned a jacket and cap, something to make him a bit less recognizable from a distance, and grabbed his own car keys. His heart pounded with a grim anticipation. He had a strong hunch where she would be going. During his research, he learned that Alexander's flagship club, Solstice, often hosted private gatherings on Fridays. If Sarah was meeting him, it could be there or perhaps at a nearby restaurant. The club itself wouldn't open to the public until later in the night, but Alexander might use his venues for private meetings. David started his car and began to follow the route he suspected she'd take toward downtown. Sure enough, a few minutes into the drive, he spotted Sarah's blue sedan a couple of cars ahead of him. Keeping a safe distance, he tailed her through the city streets, heart hammering. She drove with apparent ease, listening to music. He could see her head bob faintly. For a flash, he remembered all the times he'd watched her drive off to work, trusting and unsuspecting. Now he was trailing her like a detective in one of his film scripts. After about 20 minutes, Sarah's car turned into a side street in the Belltown neighborhood and pulled into a parking garage. David continued past, not to arouse suspicion by following her directly into the garage. He parked on the street a block away, near a coffee shop that was closed for the evening. The neon signs of clubs and bars were just flickering on as the city's nightlife woke up. He hurried on foot toward the garage, arriving just in time to see Sarah exiting on foot. She walked with a purposeful stride toward a swanky upscale restaurant on the corner, the Marquee. David recognized the name. It was known for its craft cocktails and as a hotspot for influential people. It was also only a stone's throw from Solstice. Positioning himself across the street, partially concealed by a bus stop shelter, David watched. Sarah paused outside the restaurant, checking her phone. After a minute, a black luxury sedan glided up to the curb. A valet hurried to open the passenger door. A tall man stepped out looking every bit the suave mogul that David had seen in photos. Alexander Markham had arrived. David's fists clenched at his sides as he saw his wife greet the man. Sarah's face lit up in a way that was painfully familiar. It was the look of love and excitement he used to think was reserved for him. She slid her arms around Alexander's neck, and he pulled her into an intimate kiss right there on the sidewalk, as casually as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For a second, David's vision went red. He fought the urge to stride across the street and tear them apart, but he didn't. Steady, he reminded himself. Not yet. They broke apart and Alexander said something to Sarah that made her laugh. Then he offered his arm and they headed inside the Marquee together. The valet drove off with Alexander's car, leaving the sidewalk empty as if nothing unusual had happened. David forced himself to breathe. The image of that kiss was burned into his mind. Even expecting it, it felt like a knife twisting in his gut. But with the pain came a cold clarity. There it was, proof in living color right before his eyes. His wife and Alexander Markham together, confirming every terrible suspicion. The parallel life Sarah had written about was not a fantasy at all, but a secret reality playing out in the same city where he sat in the shadows. For a few minutes, David lingered outside, debating what to do. He could try to follow them inside, but the Marquee was an upscale place. He'd stick out and possibly be noticed, blowing his cover. Besides, he didn't need to see more affection over dinner to know what was happening. He had seen enough. Instead, he walked back toward the club Solstice around the corner. The neon sun logo of the club glowed above its entrance, though the doors were closed, a sign reading, "Private event, closed tonight." Private event, David mused bitterly. Perhaps Alexander had cleared the club for a romantic after-hours rendezvous. It was exactly what he'd do if he wanted total privacy. David made a slow circuit of the block to clear his head. When he found himself back near the marquee, he saw through the glass front the shape of Sarah and Alexander seated at a secluded booth, heads close together over what looked like glasses of wine. They appeared deep in conversation, Sarah's hand resting on Alexander's. The sight hit David with a wave of nausea and heartbreak. But he steeled himself by silently reciting the facts. Sarah was living a lie, and Alexander was complicit. They were betraying him without remorse. He needed to respond, but not with a thoughtless confrontation fueled by pain. He needed to be shrewd, methodical, to use his own talents now that he understood theirs. At that moment, in this hazy glow of the city night, an idea began to form in David's mind. It was rough, born of equal parts outrage and the storyteller's instinct that had guided his career. He didn't just want to catch them. He wanted them to undo themselves. Sarah's own writing had been the key to unveiling this secret. Perhaps it could also be the key to exposing it in a way neither she nor Alexander could deny. Feeling a grim sense of purpose coiling within him, David retreated to his car. He had seen what he needed to see. Now it was time to plan his next move. The double life they thought they were leading in secret was about to collide spectacularly with reality, and David would make sure he was the one directing the scene. Chapter 4. Trap of Words. On Sunday morning, 2 days after witnessing the affair with his own eyes, David decided it was time to set his plan in motion. He found Sarah in the kitchen, leisurely reading the newspaper with a mug of tea in hand. The normalcy of the scene felt surreal given the storm of secrets swirling around them. David steadied himself, putting on an enthusiastic but casual demeanor. "Hey, I was tidying up the study yesterday and I stumbled on something," he began, pouring himself a cup of coffee. In truth, he hadn't been tidying. He had been carefully crafting this approach. "Your manuscript. The parallel life." Sarah's head jerked up, eyes wide in surprise. A mix of emotions flashed across her face. Shock, embarrassment, a touch of alarm. She set the mug down. You read it?" she asked softly. David gave an apologetic smile. "I did. Not all of it, but enough to be completely hooked." That was a lie. He devoured every word, but she didn't need to know that. He slid into the chair across from her. "I'm sorry, I know it was private. I found the flash drive and curiosity got the better of me." Sarah's cheeks had gone pale. She swallowed. "It's okay, I never meant to hide it forever, it's rough. I'm a little mortified you saw my scribbles." She tried to laugh it off, but her voice shook slightly. "It's nothing, really, just a story I toy with in my free time." "Nothing?" David let genuine admiration seep into his tone. "Sarah, it's incredible. I mean it. The psychological depth, the tension. I couldn't tear myself away. You wrote a page-turner." He reached across the table to touch her hand, the gesture so familiar yet, to him, laced with irony now. "Why didn't you tell me you were working on a novel like this?" She gave a half shrug, looking down. "It started as a personal project, more like a journal or a what-if exercise. I wasn't sure it was any good. And the content, it's pretty dark in places. I thought it might upset you considering, well, the marriage storyline." Sarah bit her lip. "I want you to know, just because I wrote about that, it doesn't mean—" She trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. David's heart thudded. Here was a subtle plea. She was testing if he suspected the content was based on reality. He kept his expression gentle and reassuring. "Hey, I get it. Writers take inspiration from all sorts of places. It doesn't mean anything about us. If anything, it shows what a great imagination you have." The lie tasted bitter, but he delivered it smoothly. Sarah exhaled, visibly relieved. "Thank you." A small smile appeared, genuine this time. "So, you really think it's good?" "Good?" David laughed. "I think it's phenomenal. You have serious talent, Sarah. Honestly." He hesitated, as if thinking, then snapped his fingers. "You know, I haven't been this excited about a story in a long time. I actually have a crazy idea." "What?" She tilted her head, curiosity piqued. "I kept imagining it on screen as I read," he said. eyes alight as if envisioning it. The atmosphere, the drama. I think it would make a fantastic movie, or a limited series at least, and I'd love to help make that happen. Sarah stared at him, stunned. A movie? David, I just wrote it for myself. I mean, I wouldn't even know where to start. Lucky for you, he grinned. You're married to a screenwriter. He gave her hand a squeeze. I can help adapt it into a screenplay. We could collaborate. Think about it. Your story, our combined skills. He emphasized our to make her feel included and valued. It could really be something. A blush of pride colored her cheeks now. Wow. I don't know, David. It's all so sudden. Do you really think it's worth adapting? Absolutely. He stood and paced a little, as if brimming with creative energy. In fact, I have a meeting with a producer friend next week. I'd love to pitch this. Maybe get some interest brewing. I wouldn't do that without your blessing, of course, and ideally your involvement every step of the way. You understand these characters on a level no one else could. Sarah's eyes were shining now, caught up in his enthusiasm. It does sound exciting, but the story is very personal. I mean, the subject matter. It might make people wonder if it's based on reality, David finished gently. She nodded, and he gave an understanding smile. That's the beauty of fiction. People will always speculate, but you and I know an artist can write about anything. Besides, we can always alter details in the screenplay for privacy. Change the setting or the occupations a bit. Composite characters. The core of it, the emotions, the psychological intrigue, that's what makes it great. She thought for a long moment, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. Finally, she looked up with a tentative grin. All right, let's do it. Let's see if we can turn my crazy scribblings into a real screenplay. David beamed, leaning over to kiss her forehead softly. You won't regret it. This story is going to blow people away. He meant it in ways she couldn't imagine, as Sarah laughed and started peppering him with ideas. Nervous, excited questions about how the adaptation process worked and whether she should change the ending. David felt a pang of something like guilt twist in his chest. Here she was, lit up with happiness, believing this was a dream opportunity, when in reality it was the bait in his carefully laid trap. He pushed the feeling down. After all, hadn't she trapped him first with lies? They spent hours that day mapping out scenes from the book on index cards across their dining table. David played the role of supportive partner and creative collaborator perfectly. At times, he almost lost himself in the act. Almost. But beneath every encouraging nod and fascinated question he posed about a character's motivation, his resolve only grew. Over the next 2 weeks, the project gained momentum. David claimed that his producer contact loved the concept. In truth, he hadn't yet shown it to anyone in the industry, but Sarah didn't know that. He insisted they move forward with drafting a screenplay and assembling a preliminary team. Sarah dove in wholeheartedly, working side by side with him in the evenings to transform her novel into script form. It seemed to bring them closer in those moments, and occasionally David could almost forget the betrayal. Almost. One evening, as they finished outlining a particularly intense scene set in a nightclub, David made his next move. We should probably consult with someone familiar with the club scene, he said casually, jotting a note, to make sure those details are authentic. Maybe even consider securing a real club as a potential filming location early on. That could help attract investors. Sarah, sitting cross-legged on the floor amid their notes, nodded. Makes sense. Did you have anyone in mind? David pretended to think for a moment. Actually, yes. There's a prominent businessman in town who owns a bunch of high-end clubs. I was introduced to him briefly at a film fundraiser last year. This was a lie, but he delivered it smoothly. Might be a good person to reach out to. He knows the ins and outs of that world and might even be interested in coming on as an advisor or financier if it strikes his fancy. Really? Who? Sarah asked, starting to gather the index cards into a neat stack. He kept his tone even. I'll reach out first, see if he's interested. No point in getting into details unless it's promising. He flashed her a confident smile. But trust me, if we get him on board, it'd be a huge win. He's very well connected in the city. Sarah accepted that with a content nod, seemingly trusting David's initiative. Okay, you're the expert at pitching. Let me know if you need me to be involved in any meetings or anything. Will do, David said, leaning over to kiss her. She responded warmly, squeezing his hand. It struck David as almost absurd. Here they were, partners in creativity discussing meetings, while she had no idea that the most important meeting was yet to come, and it would be nothing like she imagined. The next day, David put the rest of his plan into action. He contacted Alexander Markham under the guise of professional outreach. Composing the email carefully, he introduced himself as a screenwriter and producer working on an adaptation of a psychological thriller set in the upscale nightclub scene. He flattered Alexander subtly, mentioning he'd heard of Markham's sophisticated venues and philanthropic work, and proposed a meeting to discuss a potential collaboration or at least to gather authentic insights for the project. David made sure the tone was cordial and enthusiastic, just another hungry creative seeking expertise and support. It didn't take long to get a response. Alexander's assistant replied within a day, setting up an appointment for David to meet Mr. Markham at his downtown office. The quick reply suggested Alexander was intrigued, or at least not averse to dabbling in the film industry. Perhaps the flattery worked on his ego, David mused. Or perhaps Alexander's guard was down, unsuspecting that anything was amiss. On the afternoon of the meeting, David arrived at the sleek, glass-fronted building that housed Markham Entertainment Group's headquarters. Dressed in a sharp navy blazer and carrying a portfolio with script pages and promotional mock-ups, props to sell the legitimacy of the project, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. This was just another performance, he told himself, and he had every intention of stealing the show. Alexander's office was a modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay. The man himself rose from behind a chrome and oak desk to greet David. "Mr. Cole, a pleasure," Alexander said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, confident. If he felt any shock or recognition, he didn't show it. Likely, David thought, because Sarah had never disclosed much about her husband to him, or at least not enough to connect this meeting. "Thanks for taking the time, Mr. Markham," David replied with a friendly smile. It took all his willpower not to show the loathing he felt for the man. Up close, Alexander exuded charm and an easy dominance of the room. He wore a tailored charcoal suit without a tie, the top button of his dress shirt open in casual elegance. David saw Alexander's eyes flick over him, probably sizing up whether this filmmaker was worth his time. They exchanged small talk at first. David spoke a bit about his previous work and the indie award that had given him some clout. Alexander spoke about his interest in branching out into media. Apparently, he had once considered investing in a local production studio. All the while, David noted how relaxed and unsuspecting the man was. This was just business to him. "So," Alexander said once they were seated in a lounge area of the office, "tell me more about this film of yours." "My assistant mentioned it's a thriller in a nightclub setting?" He gave a charismatic half-smile. "You've got my attention, I admit. Not every day someone wants my input on something like this." "It's a unique project," David began, sliding a one-page summary across the coffee table. In the summary, he had deliberately changed names and a few key details from Sarah's novel, just in case Alexander might otherwise recognize it. The core story was the same, though framed as a general concept for now. A psychological thriller about a woman living a double life tangled with a powerful nightclub owner. Alexander scanned the page, his expression interested but neutral. "Dark secrets, love, and betrayal," he mused. "Certainly dramatic. And you said it's based on a novel?" "Yes," David nodded. "A very gripping unpublished novel by a talented local writer. I have the rights to it." He took a breath, watching Alexander carefully as he added, "We're actually already working on the screenplay, with the novelist on board to co-write." If Alexander found that significant, he didn't show it. He was focused on the summary. "Well, I appreciate the authenticity you're aiming for. What exactly do you envision my role being?" "That depends on your interest," David said smoothly. "At a minimum, I was hoping to get some insights from you. Details of the nightclub world, the lifestyle, which we could incorporate for realism. But if you find the project appealing, we'd be thrilled to have you involved in a larger capacity. Perhaps as a consultant or even an executive producer." He chuckled lightly. "Having your name attached could open a lot of doors for financing, and some of the story is practically an homage to the kind of nightlife empire you've built. Who better to help us get it right?" Alexander leaned back, a spark of pride in his eyes at that last comment. He liked that idea, David could tell. "It is true I know that world intimately," he said. "And I won't lie, the film business does sound intriguing. I've hosted some wrap parties for movies at my clubs. Never thought about actually being involved in making one." "This could be a perfect first foray," David continued, pressing the advantage. "We're keeping the budget modest, indie style, but with high production values to capture the vibe. Ideally, we'd even shoot on location at some real clubs here in Seattle. That's part of why I hoped to talk to you. You have the best venues in town. Imagine seeing one of them featured prominently, essentially immortalized on film." Alexander nodded slowly, and David could see the idea taking root. It was clear Alexander fancied himself a savvy dealmaker. Being part of a movie would be another trophy on his shelf. "All right, color me interested," he said, flashing a white-toothed smile. "What's the next step?" David allowed a satisfied grin. "If you're open to it, I'd love to set up a meeting in a week or two with the writer and my small production team. We can walk you through the story in more detail, maybe even do a script reading of a few key scenes to give you a feel for it. Then we can discuss involvement more concretely." "Sounds reasonable," Alexander said. "Though I warn you, I'm not an actor." He chuckled. "Oh, no need for that," David assured. "We just value your perspective. And if you like what you see, you could help us shape certain scenes or dialogues to ensure we nail the authenticity. We can also talk financials if you're inclined to come on board as a backer." They shook hands on that understanding. Alexander's ego had been stroked, and he seemed game to play along. As David left that day, he felt a cold thrill. The pieces were aligning. He didn't tell Sarah outright that the businessman he'd contacted was Alexander Markham. He simply mentioned that a club owner had shown interest, and they'd scheduled a development meeting with him and a few other team members David claimed to have lined up. She was a bit nervous, fussing over what parts of the script to polish before then, but David assured her it was informal. The day of the meeting arrived quickly. David arranged to use a small rehearsal space owned by a director friend who thought he was just hosting a routine table read for one of David's projects. Sarah and David arrived first, setting out printed script excerpts and preparing the room. It was a modest studio with wooden floors, folding chairs, and a long table at one end. Sarah reviewed her notes, not noticing how quiet David had grown as the time approached. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She looked a touch anxious but excited, completely oblivious to the trap she was walking into. A knock at the door made Sarah jump slightly. "That'll be him," David said. "Come in," he called. The door opened, and Alexander Markham stepped into the rehearsal space. Sarah's smile froze on her face, her entire body stiffening as if she'd seen a ghost. Her eyes darted to David, then back to Alexander. To her credit, she recovered quickly, schooling her features into a polite expression, but David caught the flicker of panic in her eyes. "Hello," Alexander said, hesitating only a fraction of a second when he saw Sarah. "I'm Alexander Markham. You must be the author?" He extended his hand to her, his face a perfect mask of cordial professionalism. Sarah took his hand after a half-beat, her smile brittle. "Yes, hi, I'm Sarah," she managed. "Sarah Cole." She emphasized her last name as if to warn him, or perhaps remind herself who she was supposed to be in this scenario. Her voice was steady, but David noticed a slight tremor in her other hand, which she quickly hid by tucking a stray hair behind her ear. David stepped forward as if pleasantly surprised. "Ah, you two haven't met yet. Alexander, this is my wife, Sarah. She's the writer I mentioned. Sarah, Mr. Markham." He looked between them with a smile. "Thank you so much for coming, Alexander." "Please, call me Alex," he insisted smoothly, finally releasing Sarah's hand. If David hadn't known better, he'd think the two were perfect strangers. They were playing their parts well, almost as well as he was. They all took seats around the small table. Sarah sat across from Alex, pointedly keeping her focus on the script pages in front of her. Alexander cleared his throat and complimented the premise of the story, saying how flattered he was to be consulted. His eyes flicked to Sarah occasionally, but his demeanor remained impeccably collected. David began guiding them through the meeting, discussing the story outline and key scenes. Sarah chimed in now and then, voice tight at first but gradually finding its rhythm as the focus shifted to her work. If one didn't know any better, one might think she was simply a passionate author eager to impress a potential backer. Alexander listened, offered a few generic ideas about club atmospheres, and mostly observed. But David could read the subtle tension beneath their performances, the slight pallor of Sarah's complexion, the way Alexander kept his hands clasped perhaps a bit too firmly on the table to disguise any tremor. They were on edge, trying to act normal under the most abnormal of circumstances. It was almost thrilling to watch, but David maintained his facade of oblivious enthusiasm. After an hour of discussion and a short reading of a couple of scenes, during which David had Sarah read one character's lines while he read the other to demonstrate the dramatic potential, the meeting wrapped up positively. David suggested that Alexander drop by the set once they begin initial shooting of a teaser trailer, to which he agreed. They all stood and exchanged pleasantries as if nothing was amiss. "This was great," David said, shaking Alexander's hand warmly at the door. "We'll be in touch soon with more pages. Your input is going to really elevate this project." "I'm looking forward to it," Alexander replied. He met Sarah's eyes briefly. "Mrs. Cole, a pleasure meeting you. You're very talented." Sarah smiled politely, the compliment hitting awkwardly between them. "Thank you, and thank you for your time and interest." With that, Alexander excused himself. The moment the door shut behind him, Sarah let out a shaky breath and sank into a chair, closing her eyes. "Wow," she murmured. "I was so nervous. He's, very impressive, isn't he?" Her tone was forced light. "He is," David said, pretending to be oblivious to the true cause of her nerves. He started gathering the script pages, hiding the triumphant gleam in his eyes under the guise of tidying up. "I think it went extremely well. He seemed quite taken with you, with your story." "You think so?" Sarah looked simultaneously relieved and anxious. "I hope we didn't come off unprepared. I wasn't expecting someone like him to be interested." "You did great," David assured her, truth in his words in a way she wouldn't understand. "Now we've got a powerful ally on board. This is really happening." Sarah stood and came over to him, hugging him tightly. He returned the embrace, feeling her heart hammering against his chest. "Thank you, David," she whispered, "for believing in me and this story. This feels like a dream." He held her and murmured, "Of course. We're a team." Then he added softly, so she couldn't see the ice in his eyes, "And the best is yet to come." Chapter 5. Double Game. The production of the film, still a small, tightly knit project at this stage, moved forward under David's direction. On the surface, everything was going remarkably well. Sarah poured her energy into polishing the script, sometimes working late at night on dialogue. Alexander, officially sporting a producer credit now, provided access to his clubs for location shoots and had even contributed a modest investment to cover initial filming costs. With resources and a script in hand, David assembled a skeleton crew and a handful of local actors for a test shoot intended to double as a promo reel for larger funding. In those weeks, Sarah and Alexander maintained their facade of polite distance in public. On set, they interacted professionally, if a bit formally, always careful to stay in their appropriate roles. David observed their dance with clinical interest. When he caught them stealing a guarded glance at each other, he pretended not to notice. If their conversations during breaks were a touch too familiar in tone, he said nothing. He let them believe they were fooling him, and perhaps everyone else. But behind the scenes, he kept a tight grip on the situation. He scheduled shoots in ways that kept both Sarah and Alex involved and present as often as possible. He claimed it was vital for the writer to be on set to fine-tune dialogue and for the producer-consultant to advise on club authenticity. The crew found nothing unusual in this. If anything, they were impressed that the project's backer was so hands-on and that the writer herself was available to help. For David, each day of filming was a balancing act of stirring emotions without spilling secrets, at least not until he was ready. He shot moody scenes in Alexander's clubs, late at night after closing, with skeletal lighting and real atmosphere. Sarah watched from just off-camera, her face a mix of pride and hidden anxiety as she saw her story coming to life. Alexander gave occasional pointers about how bartenders might act or how VIP patrons might behave, which the cast appreciated. To an outsider, It was a collaborative labor of love. Yet underneath, the tension in the triangle subtly grew. David could see it in how Sarah would avoid being alone with Alex, always standing on the opposite side of a group. He saw it in how Alex, usually so composed, tightened his jaw whenever David affectionately touched Sarah's shoulder or waist in front of him. They thought they were being careful, and to most people they were. But David caught every telltale sign of their suppressed relationship. It both enraged and energized him to keep pushing toward the climax he had in mind. That climax came during the filming of one of the story's pivotal scenes. In the script, it was the moment the protagonist's husband confronts her about the affair, a raw, emotional showdown in their home's living room. David had scheduled this scene toward the end of the shoot for the week, claiming he wanted the actors to have time to build chemistry before tackling such heavy material. In truth, he wanted Sarah and Alex's nerves at their peak. The actors playing the fictional couple, Helen and Mark, stand-ins for Sadie and Daniel from the novel, had rehearsed the confrontation, but something about it wasn't clicking. The actress, a talented woman named Nina, was struggling to convey the depth of betrayal and guilt in the confession scene. After a few tepid takes, David called cut. The small crew in the house set, a rented suburban home serving as the film's location, relaxed, and Nina rubbed her eyes, apologizing. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm just not feeling it fully. I need a minute." David glanced at Sarah, who was sitting at the monitor nearby. She looked emotionally wound up just watching the attempts. He saw an opportunity and seized it. "Nina, why don't we try something different?" he suggested. "Let's run the scene in a workshop style. Sarah, would you mind stepping in for a run-through? Not on camera, just to explore the emotions. You know this character better than anyone. You could show Nina how you envision the wife's feelings in this moment." Sarah's eyes widened. She hadn't expected to be asked to perform. "Oh, I'm not an actress, David," she protested lightly, glancing quickly toward Alexander, who stood behind the crew, arms folded. "I'm not sure I'd do it justice either." "You don't have to act, just be yourself," David coaxed with an easy smile. "Think of it like when we talked through scenes at home. You explained Sadie's mindset so well then. Just do that, but with our actor here so she can pick up on it. It might help a lot." He turned to Nina. "If Sarah reads the lines opposite you for a few, maybe it'll spark something." Nina nodded earnestly. "I'd actually love that, if you're willing, Sarah." All eyes turned to Sarah. She was cornered. To refuse would seem odd and uncooperative. With a visible swallow, she nodded. "Okay, sure, I'll try." David motioned the crew to keep the cameras rolling. "Just for reference," he said casually, "we might capture something organic." The cinematographer, unaware of any ulterior motive, adjusted his shoulder camera to follow the upcoming rehearsal. Sarah took Nina's place on the set, facing the actor playing her husband. The scene began quietly, with the husband character accusing, and the wife character, now Sarah, initially denying, then gradually breaking down. As the actor delivered his lines of suspicion and hurt, Sarah responded script in hand, but eyes lifting increasingly to meet his. She started off measured, imitating the tone Nina had used, but David wasn't about to let it stay that way. He stepped closer behind the camera, calling out directing notes with gentle urgency. "Sarah, don't be afraid to really feel it. This is your husband, the man you love, and you're about to hurt him with the truth. Let it out." Sarah shot David a nervous glance. Her face was already drawn, and he could tell the scenario was churning up genuine emotion. Still, she pressed on, voice trembling as she spoke the scripted confession. "I never meant for this to happen. It just did. He made me feel alive." Louder, more desperate, David urged. "This is the moment of truth. Everything is on the line." The actor playing her husband gripped her by the shoulders as per the blocking and shouted, "Who is he?" Sarah flinched convincingly, tears springing to her eyes. "Someone I met at the clinic," she said, echoing the scripted answer. David moved even closer, heart pounding in his chest. He lowered his voice intimately, so only she could hear. "Why, Sarah? Tell him why." He deliberately used her real name, not the character's. She sucked in a breath, and for a moment her eyes flickered toward him in confusion. A tear rolled down her cheek. I I was lonely, she said, voice barely above a whisper. Those words weren't in the script. The script had a line about being unfulfilled or seeking thrill, but she had said lonely. Keep going, David urged softly, his own emotions roiling now. The entire crew was silent, drawn into the raw authenticity of the moment. Alexander had stepped forward from the shadows, his face tense. The actor held her shoulders firmly, in character, demanding, "Did you love him?" Sarah's eyes brimmed over. She dropped the script pages, no longer reading from them. Her next words came out in a ragged plea. "No, it wasn't love. It was never love. It was a mistake. I'm so sorry." Her gaze drifted, unfocused, as if she was no longer speaking to the fictional husband, but to someone else, someone not in the scene. David's throat tightened. He recognized that look. She had slipped fully into Sadie's mind, or rather, into her own confession. "How long?" the actor demanded on cue, eyes wide with hurt. Sarah shook her head, tears spilling freely now. "Too long," she choked out. "I should have ended it. I wanted to, but I was afraid. I didn't know how to stop." Sobs punctuated her words. "Please, please forgive me." Her knees seemed to give way, and the actor eased her to the floor as the script had indicated for the climax of the scene. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing, "I'm sorry, David. I'm so sorry." But the script didn't call for using the husband's actual name. In the story, the husband's name was Mark. Sarah had said David. A stunned hush fell in the room. The actor looked up at the director uncertainly, not sure if he should continue or cut. The crew exchanged glances. Some looked moved, others confused. Alexander took a half step forward, his lips parted as if to speak. Before anyone could break the spell, David, with a lump in his own throat, quickly signaled for the main camera operator to keep rolling. This was what he needed on film. He stepped into the scene slightly. "Why are you sorry, Sadie?" he asked gently, deliberately using the character's name to remind her where she was. But Sarah was too far gone in the emotion. She lowered her hands from her tear-streaked face and looked up at the actor. No, past him, to where David stood behind the lights. Her eyes locked on her husband's. "I'm sorry I lied," she gasped out. "About all those nights, about Los Angeles, about everything. I didn't want to hurt you. I swear I never wanted to hurt you." She broke down again, covering her mouth as if the truth was pouring out uncontrollably. Alexander moved briskly then, stepping around the camera. "All right, I think that's enough," he said, his voice calm but taut. He reached Sarah in 2 strides and helped her to her feet. She clung to his arm for a second as she steadied herself, her composure utterly shattered. Alexander's jaw was set, but he stroked her back in what he tried to pass off as a consoling gesture. To the onlooking crew, it might have seemed like a producer comforting an overwhelmed writer who had poured too much of herself into the scene. But some of them had clearly picked up on odd details, the name confusion, the intensity. The cinematographer slowly lowered his camera, eyes darting between Sarah and Alexander with dawning suspicion. The sound technician glanced at David, eyebrows raised, as if waiting for direction in this unscripted drama. David forced a smile onto his face, stepping forward briskly. "Yes, that was incredibly powerful," he said, clapping his hands together once as if concluding an exercise. His heart was racing, and he hoped his face didn't betray it. "Thank you, Sarah, for that. And Nina, did you feel the difference?" Nina, who had been watching from just off-set, nodded slowly, eyes wide. "That was intense," she said. "I definitely see what you mean about the emotions." She offered Sarah a timid smile. "Thank you for sharing that, Sarah." Sarah quickly wiped at her cheeks, stepping away from Alexander as if realizing only now that she was holding on to him. I'm sorry," she stammered to the room at large, voice shaky. "I didn't mean to lose it like that. I guess the story, it's very personal to me." "No apologies needed," David said warmly, crossing over to gently rub Sarah's shoulder in a husbandly way. She stiffened almost imperceptibly under his touch. "This is exactly why having you with us is invaluable. You set the bar for authenticity just now." He looked around at the crew. "Let's take 5, everyone. Reset, and then Nina will take it from the top with that energy." "Great work." The crew gradually broke apart, some still casting puzzled looks as they stepped outside or into the kitchen for a breather. The actor playing the husband patted Sarah awkwardly on the arm before excusing himself. Soon it was just the three of them, David, Sarah, and Alexander, alone in the faux living room. Sarah avoided both of their gazes, focusing on gathering the fallen script pages with trembling hands. Alexander cleared his throat. "Sarah, are you all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded quickly, still not meeting his eyes. Yes, yes, I'm fine." Her voice was thick from crying. "Sorry, I don't know what came over me." "No need to apologize," David said gently, tilting his head sympathetically. That was quite a moment. Finally, Sarah looked at him. David saw raw fear in her red-rimmed eyes, even as she tried to smile. "I might step outside for some air," she murmured. "Excuse me." She brushed past them both and hurried out the front door of the house set into the cool evening air. Alexander moved as if to follow her, but David subtly stepped into his path. "Give her a minute," he said softly. Their eyes met. In Alexander's, David saw panic and anger swirling beneath the polished surface. "That was risky," Alexander said under his breath, keeping his voice low to avoid being overheard by any lingering crew. "What was?" David replied, feigning ignorance. His blood was thundering in his ears. Alexander's nostrils flared slightly. "Pushing her like that, she's not an actress, you pushed her too far." David held the other man's gaze, a faint smile touching his lips. "It's a director's job to push for authenticity. You of all people said you wanted it real." His words were innocuous, but there was an undercurrent that they both understood. Alexander opened his mouth to retort, but then closed it. He glanced toward the door through which Sarah had fled, clearly torn. "I should check on her," he said finally, attempting to move past. This time David let him. He watched as Alexander went out into the twilight, presumably to find Sarah and reassure her. Or perhaps to make sure she wouldn't accidentally blurt out any more truth in front of others. David exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. His own heart was pounding from the intensity of what had transpired. It took all of his willpower not to follow them, but he knew there would be other eyes and ears outside, and he wanted to maintain his role a little longer. Besides, everything he needed was already captured on film. He glanced over at the main camera still on its tripod. The red recording light had been on the whole time. A sense of grim satisfaction welled up in him. They had just given themselves away, perhaps not entirely openly, but enough for those with eyes to see, and crucially enough that he could prove it later. The double game they thought they were playing was tilting irreversibly in his favor. Chapter 6. Finale of the show. In the weeks that followed the tumultuous shoot, David worked in quiet secrecy to assemble the final cut of the film. Officially, the project was still in rough edit stage, with only a small circle expecting to see an early version. Unofficially, David was crafting a very specific director's cut, one that blurred the line between fiction and reality beyond recognition. He spent long days and late nights in the editing suite, poring over footage. The centerpiece of his cut was the confrontation scene. He had everything on camera. Sarah's breakdown, her inadvertent confession, the raw pain in her voice as she spoke what was essentially the truth, and Alexander stepping into frame to comfort her by her real name. It was all there. With a storyteller's precision, David edited the film so that this scene played out almost unaltered. He resisted the urge to clean up the audio too much or cut away at the most incriminating moments. In fact, he even overlaid a brief voiceover earlier in the film, one of Sarah's recorded reflections from an on-set interview, where she had poetically described the protagonist's feeling of living a lie. He placed that audio right before the climactic reveal, setting the stage for the reality to bleed through the screen. When he was done, the film was something more than an adaptation of a novel. It was a confession captured in real time, a story about betrayal that betrayed its creators in turn. And he ensured it would be seen by more than just the intimate circle of cast and crew. David arranged a small pre-release screening under the pretense of getting feedback and drumming up buzz. He chose a cozy, independent theater in downtown Seattle for the venue. Invitations were sent to the crew and actors, a few industry contacts, some of David's and Sarah's mutual friends, and importantly, a couple of local entertainment journalists who were always keen on a sensational story. Alexander, as a producer, naturally received an invitation as well, though David doubted he would attend in person after how filming had wrapped. Sarah initially balked at the idea of inviting press so early, but David reassured her, saying it was all part of generating word of mouth for when they officially launched the film. In truth, he counted on those reporters to witness what was about to unfold. The night of the screening, the small theater buzzed with polite chatter. Sarah sat in the front row beside David, looking nervous but trying to smile. She wore a modest black dress and had her hair down, perhaps hoping to project confidence. David could feel her trembling occasionally next to him. Alexander was conspicuously absent from the front row, where a seat had been reserved for him. However, David spotted him slipping in after the lights dimmed, choosing to sit in a shadowy back corner. Perhaps he thought staying out of the spotlight would save face. The film began, and at first the audience responded as any audience would to a taut drama. They gasped at the right moments of foreshadowing, murmured appreciatively at the lush shots of the club scenes, laughed softly at a few moments of levity early on. Sarah eased slightly, the validation of seeing her story on screen and the audience's engagement giving her confidence that this was a success. She even reached over in the dark and squeezed David's hand, as if to say thank you. David squeezed back, his eyes fixed forward, steeling himself for what was to come. As the climactic confrontation scene loomed, an uneasy hush fell over the theater. The rawness of the performances commanded absolute attention. On screen, the husband character cornered the wife in their living room, demanding the truth. The camera lingered on the wife's face, Sarah's face. David had spliced in just a few frames where one could clearly see it was Sarah herself, not the actress, in that breakdown moment. In those frames, she wasn't playing a character at all, just a woman in agony, tears streaming down. It was brief, almost subliminal, but enough to plant a seed of recognition in the minds of those who knew her. Then came the audio, her voice, cracking and real. "I'm sorry, David. I never wanted to hurt you." Gasps rippled through the audience. On screen, the husband character's name was Mark, yet here was the wife crying out an apology to David. In the row behind, one of Sarah's friends whispered loudly, "Did she say David?" Another friend leaned forward, peering at Sarah in confusion. Sarah went rigid beside David. In the flickering light from the screen, he saw her eyes widen in horror. Her own voice continued to pour from the speakers, uncensored. "I lied about all those nights. About Los Angeles." The image cut to the scene's end. Her collapsed on the floor, sobbing, with Alexander stepping into frame calling out, "Sarah!" in his unmistakable tone. A collective shock swept the room. This wasn't just a film anymore. It was clearly something more. People exchanged startled glances. The entertainment journalists were scribbling furiously in their notepads. As the final scene faded and the credits rolled, a heavy silence hung in the air. Then came the murmurs, growing louder by the second. In the front, one of David's colleagues from the film community turned to him with a look of astonishment and pity. Several heads in the audience turned toward Sarah, who sat frozen, face pale as ash. For a moment, no one moved. Then an older gentleman, one of Sarah's mentors from the counseling center, spoke up, voice bewildered and stern. "What on earth did we just watch?" That broke the dam. Questions erupted from all sides. "Was this based on a true story?" a journalist called out. "Sarah, is that you on screen?" another friend gasped. Sarah slowly stood up, shaking. I need to go," she whispered, not to anyone in particular. She clutched her purse to her chest as if trying to make herself small and edged toward the aisle. At the same time, Alexander emerged from the shadows at the back, striding quickly up the side aisle toward the exit. But the press had spotted him. "Mr. Markham," one of the journalists shouted. "Care to comment on this story? Is it about you?" Alexander didn't answer. He kept his head down and pushed through the door, fleeing into the lobby. The theater was descending into chaos. Some audience members were trying to comfort Sarah's parents, who had also been invited and now sat in mortified shock. Others were peppering David with confused queries. Was this some kind of art imitating life? Was it a prank? An expose? David rose slowly, letting the noise wash over him. He could just make out Sarah's figure disappearing out the door. She hadn't even looked at him. "Thank you all for coming," David said, raising his voice. There was a peculiar calm in him now as he surveyed the stunned, disbelieving crowd. The film, as you likely realize, is a bit unorthodox. Everything you've seen tonight is real. A hush fell as people strained to hear. David continued, heart pounding but voice steady. This started as a work of fiction, but sometimes fiction reveals the truth. I'm sorry to have shocked you all, but I felt it was important, to be honest, at least through art. His words were deliberately vague and artistic sounding, enough to confirm the truth without spelling it out like an accusation. The journalists needed no further confirmation. They were already darting out, phones in hand, maybe hoping to catch Sarah or Alexander outside, and certainly to file the scoop of the year. Friends and colleagues of the couple looked on in dismay and disbelief. A friend of Sarah's from book club was quietly crying, while one of David's fellow writers shook his head, muttering, "My God." In the midst of the chaos, David stepped down from the front and made his way toward the exit. Each step felt strangely light, detached. This was the moment he had worked so meticulously to create. He had exposed their betrayal under the brightest light possible, public scrutiny, and the audience's reaction told him it landed exactly as he intended. Just before he pushed the door open to the lobby, he turned back for one last look. On the screen, his name lingered in the credits as director and writer. The theater was still abuzz with shock and horror at what they had learned. It was, without a doubt, a finale no one would forget. With a faint, rueful smile, David slipped out, leaving the stunned audience and the shattered remains of his old life behind him in the darkened theater. Chapter 7. Shards. The days after the explosive screening passed in a blur of repercussions. It was as if a bomb had gone off in their lives, and now the shrapnel was raining down. News of the scandal spread quickly, first through whispers among friends and colleagues, and then in more public forums. A local arts blogger published a scathing piece about the shocking cinematic expos that had played out, thinly veiled, at the screening. By the following week, even mainstream media picked up the story in cautious terms, referring to an unnamed Seattle psychologist and prominent nightclub owner embroiled in an affair, revealed through a controversial film by the woman's husband. Those who knew, knew. And soon, even those who didn't know the trio personally could read between the lines. Sarah's professional reputation crumbled almost overnight. Clients canceled appointments one after another. A few kindly cited needing to take a break, but most offered no excuse. Within a week, the waiting room that was once full of people seeking her counsel was empty. The clinic's board where she consulted convened a meeting to discuss the ethical implications of the situation. One of her colleagues, who had been a friend, gently suggested she take an indefinite leave of absence. It was clear they saw her not as a healer now, but as someone deeply in need of help herself, or simply someone they couldn't trust. She resigned from her position before they could dismiss her. Alexander fared no better. His shiny image as a charismatic entrepreneur took a hit as the whispers circulated among Seattle's elite. An investor in his hospitality group pulled out of a tentative new project, citing concerns about stability. A longtime business partner demanded a private audit of the club finances. Alexander's personal life had raised questions about his judgment, and opportunistic rivals scented blood. To make matters worse, a city council member who had been friendly with Alexander and instrumental in smoothing permits for his clubs publicly distanced himself, calling for a review of all the club licenses. The pretext was routine oversight, but everyone knew it was politically safer to not be associated with scandal. Legal troubles loomed on the horizon as regulators started snooping around minor code violations at his establishments. In the court of public opinion, both Sarah and Alexander were convicted swiftly. Online forums buzzed with gossip and moral outrage. The story had all the elements that people love to dissect: sex, lies, and a dramatic public comeuppance. And what of David? He found himself oddly removed from it all, like an observer watching the wreckage from a distance. He had not seen Sarah in person since the night of the screening. She hadn't come home afterward. In fact, she hadn't returned to their house at all in the first few days after, likely staying with her parents or a close friend. David, for his part, couldn't bear to sleep in the bed they'd shared. He spent his nights on the couch, staring at the ceiling until exhaustion claimed him in the early hours. One drizzly afternoon, about a week after the screening, David returned home from a meeting with an attorney, formalizing the steps to separate their lives, to find Sarah's car in the driveway. His heart lurched unexpectedly at the sight. Steeling himself, he walked inside to find her in the living room, stuffing clothes and personal items hastily into a suitcase. Another box sat by the coffee table, half filled with books and framed photos. She looked up when he entered, her eyes puffy and red. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rain tapping against the window. Sarah broke the silence first. "I'm just picking up some things," she said hoarsely. Her voice had a defeated flatness he'd never heard before. David nodded, shrugging off his wet jacket. He remained by the doorway, uncertain whether to advance or keep his distance. "Go ahead," he replied quietly. She resumed packing, avoiding looking at him. Her movements were jerky, as if she were trying very hard to hold herself together through each shirt folded, each book placed in the box. He watched her for a minute, memories of better times swirling with the bitter present. This was the woman he'd loved deeply, and even now he couldn't turn off that feeling entirely. But layered atop that love was so much hurt and anger, he didn't know what to say to her. It was she who found words first. As she closed the suitcase and pulled at its zipper, she swallowed and said, "Congratulations." David's brow furrowed. "What?" Sarah looked up at him then, and he saw an emptiness in her eyes that cut through him. "Congratulations," she repeated with a shaky breath. "You won, David. You got everything out in the open. You destroyed any illusion about me, about Alex, about us." Her voice cracked on the last word. He opened his mouth, but she pressed on, her tone turning accusatory and anguished. "Was it worth it?" she demanded, a flicker of the old Sarah, fierce and passionate, surfacing. "To humiliate us like that? To humiliate yourself?" She gestured around, at nothing, at everything. "All our friends know, our families, strangers know, for God's sake." A tear escaped down her cheek, but her expression was one of anger. "You could have just asked me, confronted me in private. We could have dealt with it quietly. But you made it a spectacle. Why?" David felt a surge of defensiveness. "Why?" he echoed, stepping forward. "You're really asking me why, after what you did?" She winced, but her eyes stayed on him. "I know I hurt you. I know that." Her voice softened, trembling. "And I will regret it for the rest of my life, but what you did—" She closed her eyes, pained. "It was cruel, David. It was artistic, I suppose, in a twisted way, but so cruel. You wanted me to feel as devastated as you did, is that it?" He clenched his jaw. "I wanted the truth, Sarah. I wanted everyone to see the truth. I wanted you to face it." She laughed then, a hollow, bitter laugh. "Face it? I have no choice but to face it. Every single day now, for who knows how long. Do you think I can ever have a normal life here again? Every former client, every colleague, they look at me, and all they see is that woman from your film." She spat the word "your" with a mix of resentment and sorrow. David's anger wavered as he listened. He had prepared for her to yell, to apologize, to blame. But hearing her describe the fallout pressed on a part of him he hadn't fully acknowledged. Guilt. He had done this to her, just as surely as she had done what she did to him. "We're selling the house," Sarah said abruptly, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "My parents will help me with a lawyer if needed, but I assume you've already seen one." Her glance flicked to the folder of papers poking out of his satchel. Indeed, the separation documents were there. "I'll sign whatever. I don't care anymore." He looked down at the floor, a knot in his throat. This was not how he'd imagined feeling at this juncture. He thought vindication would taste sweeter. Instead, it was ashy and bitter. "I never meant for things to go so far," he said, almost to himself. "Really?" Sarah gave him a sad, skeptical look. "What exactly did you think would happen? That I'd watch that and suddenly be cleansed of my sins? That Alex and I would slink away quietly and you'd be celebrated as some truth teller?" She shook her head. "Actions have consequences. You and I of all people should know that. Me as a counselor, you as a writer. We make choices, and we have to live with them." David felt the sting of her words. I wasn't looking to be celebrated, he muttered. Good, she said flatly. Because you're not. People are horrified, David. They pity you, or they think you're a monster, or both. Some friends won't even return my calls. Not to comfort me, just because they don't want to be involved in this disaster at all. She sighed, shoulders slumping. We've both lost so much. Silence fell between them, heavy with truth. Outside, the rain fell harder, drumming on the roof like a dirge. I'm sorry, Sarah whispered then, her anger dissolving into sorrow. Not just for betraying you with Alex, but for everything. For all of this. She gestured vaguely, tears flowing again. I never wanted to hurt you. I was foolish and selfish, and I ruined the best thing in my life. And in return, her voice broke. You ruined me back. A crack sounded in David's chest, and suddenly he couldn't breathe. He realized in that moment that this was the closure he'd been heading for, and it was utterly hollow. There was no triumph here, no righteous satisfaction. Just two broken people in an empty home, surrounded by the shards of their life together. He wanted to tell her he was sorry too, but the words stuck. He was sorry. Sorry for the pain, sorry for the love that had turned to hate and then to this aching regret. But his pride wouldn't let him say it aloud. Instead, he simply nodded. Sarah looked at him for a long, searching moment, as if hoping for something more. But David had nothing more to give. With a resigned nod of her own, she hoisted her suitcase and grabbed the box of belongings. He moved to help her, but she stiffened and managed on her own. At the door, she paused, one hand on the frame. Without turning around, she said softly, Goodbye, David. He stared at her back, his throat burning. Goodbye, Sarah, he replied. She left, closing this door behind her with a final, muted thud. David stood in the silent living room for a long time, surrounded by the empty spaces where her presence used to be. The home felt like a stranger's house now, sterile, devoid of warmth. On the mantel, a single framed photo remained, the two of them on their wedding day, beaming with innocent joy. He walked over and picked it up, hands trembling. They looked so young, so hopeful, as if those people were completely unrelated to who they were now. With a shuddering breath, David set the picture face down and sank onto the couch. The enormity of what had happened and what he had done settled on him. The satisfaction he'd anticipated, the closure, it was nowhere to be found. All that remained were the shards of trust, love, and lives shattered beyond repair. And in that moment, David understood the real cost of his revenge. He had paid with his own happiness, and there was no refund to claim. Chapter 8, Acceptance. Spring on the Washington coast was chilly and tranquil. David found solace in a small town by the ocean, miles away from Seattle and its ghosts. The town, little more than a fishing village with a scenic lighthouse and a cluster of weathered cottages, offered him the anonymity and peace he craved. Here, he wasn't the talk of gossip circles or the infamous filmmaker of a scandalous piece. He was just another newcomer renting a modest bungalow near the dunes. Each morning, he walked the desolate shoreline with a cup of black coffee, the salt air cleansing his lungs. The roar of the Pacific was constant company, a reminder of nature's indifferent vastness. It soothed him, this realization that the world was bigger than his pain. The waves washed away footprints within seconds, proof that, given time, even the deepest marks could be erased or at least blurred. In the afternoons, David wrote, not a screenplay this time, but a novel. Page by page, he poured out everything. The love that once lifted him, the betrayal that broke him, the revenge that hollowed him out. It was a catharsis of sorts. He wrote in a plain notebook longhand, sitting by a window that overlooked the gray-blue sea. There was no rush, no deadline, and no audience in mind. Only the need to understand himself and what life had become. Some evenings, he'd stroll into the town's only bar, a cozy tavern where the locals would nod hello, but leave him be. He appreciated that. He wasn't ready for real socializing, for questions about his past or plans for his future. The bartender learned his drink of choice after a week, a simple whiskey neat, and would have it ready by the time David reached the counter. In the corner of the bar stood an old jukebox that played tunes from decades ago. Sometimes a melancholy ballad would drift through the air, and David would find himself lost in memory. It was during one such evening, as a soulful song crackled from the jukebox, that he realized he hadn't thought about Sarah or Alexander for a whole day. The revelation was subtle but profound. The pain was still there, yes, but it was no longer all-consuming. Other thoughts, about the chapter he was writing, about the way the sunset looked over the water, about nothing in particular, had finally taken up space in his mind. He took out his notebook right there at the bar and jotted a line. Waves erase what came before, and each new day arrives on a blank tide. It wasn't perfect prose, but it captured what he felt at that moment. A sense that maybe, just maybe, he could start over. By the time summer approached, David had finished a rough draft of his new novel. It wasn't a tale of vengeance nor a bitter expose. If anything, it was a story about love and loss, about the thin line between justice and cruelty, about how even the best of intentions can lead us astray. It was, in many ways, about him, and about Sarah, though he wrote of fictional characters finding forgiveness in places he hadn't expected. Perhaps he was finding a bit of that himself, slowly. One calm afternoon, David printed out the manuscript and took it to the beach. He sat on a driftwood log and thumbed through the pages, the breeze riffling them when he didn't hold them down. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, about the man he was a year ago and the man he had become. They felt like two different people. He realized he would never be entirely free of what happened. The scars were there, but scars meant healing too. He would carry the lessons, painful as they were, into whatever came next. There was a strange peace in that acceptance. As the sun dipped low, David packed up his pages. Tomorrow, he decided, he would drive into the nearest town with a post office and mail the manuscript to his agent in Seattle. He wasn't sure if he intended to publish it or if it was just a symbolic act of closure, but it felt right to send this story out into the world, separate from himself. Walking back to his bungalow in the golden light, David felt the slightest hint of optimism warming the edges of his heart. The future was uncertain. He was living in a rented cottage with no clear plan, estranged from his old life. And yet, he was surviving. More than that, on some days he felt the stirrings of a will to truly live again. That evening he sat on the porch and watched as the stars blinked into existence one by one. The sound of waves carried on the wind. David thought of the final lines of his new book, which he had written just hours ago. In the end, the truth had set him free, but not in the way he expected. It was a quiet freedom, the kind that comes not from justice or revenge, but from the release of all those dark weights and the decision to step forward into whatever dawn might come. He closed his eyes and let the cool night air fill his lungs. In that still moment, he finally felt it, the dawn within. It wasn't brightness or joy, not yet, but it was acceptance, and for now, that was enough.